fantastic. Anyway, you and everybody, you should clap. Hi there, well, thanks very much for inviting me. My name is Dr. Ewan Kirkland. I teach film and screen studies at the University of Brighton, which is a very interesting degree. We sort of look at, obviously look at film, but we also look at television, we look at video games, we look at mobile phones. We're basically about looking at the connection between different kinds of screens and different kinds of screen cultures. I did a PhD in something completely different from what I'm talking about today. I did a PhD on children's cinema, and I looked at children's movies like Matilda and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, and that was quite a long time ago. I've subsequently done various publications. I'm quite sort of broad in my remit, so I've written on the Powerpuff Girls and Dora the Explorer. Wrote a paper on Robin Williams, the late Robin Williams, a kind of Star Studies piece, and I've written on Little Big Planet. More recently, I've started doing work on horror, and I'm interested in issues of representation. So I've done a lot of work on representation of whiteness, particularly in horror movies and horror television, so things like Dexter and the Twilight series and Buffy. I also ran various conferences. In 2006, I think it was, I ran the first, it was probably later than that, maybe 2008, I did the first ever conference on Battlestar Galactica. Thank you. And I've got, in next year, I'm hoping to run a conference on zombies, which is going to have a whole panel on zombies and video games. And I live in Brighton. There's just recently been a board game brought out called Zombie N1, which is a kind of a zombie apocalypse game set in Brighton. Which is, we've got the guys who created that are going to come and give a talk about it. I've also, as well as Battlestar Galactica, also in June this year, I did the first ever conference on My Little Pony.
Woo!
Absolutely. So yeah, first and as I don't think only one so far, but it's still early days. And I'm hoping to do something on Disney princesses. I'm still very interested in issues around children's culture, and quite often people say, well, if you're doing work on children's culture, and that's why you talk about video games, isn't it? Because video games are for kids. And I said, no, not really, because the kind of games I mainly write about are things like Silent Hill, which is a little. If anyone wants to break into academia, it's a really good idea to find something nobody's writing about and become an absolute expert on it, and become the only person who actually writes about this subject. So I've published. These are kind of the main ones, but I've been writing about Silent Hill and horror video games for quite a while now, so they're various kind of publications. One of them, Games and Culture, which is a academic games journal, journal of media practice. Camera Obscura, which is a feminist film journal, which I think that's the only thing they've ever published on video games. I looked at issues to do with masculinity and argue that Silent Hill, particularly Silent Hill 2, is a game which is kind of like about misogyny. It's quite an interesting game if anyone's ever played it. It's the male character within it is not kind of traditional, or what most people associate with the traditional masculine disposition of a video game hero. And these are some of the questions which I've asked, and video game scholarship is really in its early stages at the moment. I mean, it's only 2001 the first online academic journal, Game Studies, the International Journal of Computer Game Studies, was published online, and 2001 was claimed to be the year zero of video game scholarship. There are a few publications before that, but since then, every year there's more and more books and studies and readers coming out looking at video games. Some of the questions I can ask: how can cultural theories and approaches drawn from literature, film and television studies be applied to video games? Because you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but at the same time video games are different to all those other media and do things in a different way. And some of the kind of things like the kind of jump tactics, which we talked about earlier, those can only really work in the way they do in a video game. What happens with video games make the player aware of the fact they're playing a video game. This is something I was quite interested in, the moments where the fourth wall is broken. I was just talking earlier about a moment in Silent Hill, Shattered Memories, and how many of you played that game? It's fascinating. It's a moment when the phone rings and it's your Wiimote which is ringing, and then you realise it's your ear and someone talks to you, and it's such a weird moment because it's absolutely terrifying, but it's like the wall of the screen is being broken, and the kind of spookiness is intruding into the game, into your real space, and there's this kind of contradictory moment there, because you think if the fourth wall's being broken, you're being made aware that you're playing a video game. You kind of are. But at the same time, it's really scary, and it's almost that rupture between the two spaces is what makes it frightening. What is the position of the player in relation to characters in a video game, the psychological state, and the actions they perform? I think in video game scholarship we need to develop a sort of avatar theory. There isn't yet a theory of what our relationship is with that avatar, with that thing on the screen. There's a lot of nonsense talked about how we become the character or how we're immersed in the character, whereas I don't become Lara Croft when I'm playing Tomb Raider. I don't become the character when I'm playing a first-person shooter because I can't see them. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I'm like a disembodied head floating in space. And even when I can see the character, I don't become them, but I still have a relationship with them. I'm quite interested in what that is. And of course, it's not uniform, it's not the same across different games. So, I mean, what I do is I focus on particular games or particular game genres and talk about how they operate. How does the video game industry seek to define its own products? One of the pieces I wrote for Games and Culture was about rather than looking at the game Silent Hill, I looked at the material that Konami was publishing around it. So, I mean, for example, if anyone's bought Silent Hill 2 when it first came out, it was really interesting because it was in a cardboard box rather than plastic box. It had an extra disc in it which contained a kind of making of documentary, as well as all this kind of adverts and concept art, which is really unusual. Games don't usually do that. And Metal Gear Solid did the same thing by the same company at the same time, produces kind of this double disc release. And I sort of compared the way in which those two documentaries were working and how I argue that there's a kind of sense of artistry that Konami was trying to construct around its game. What is the relationship between video games and other artistic cultures such as literature, painting and cinema? And so this talk I'm really going to be focusing on the work I've done looking at the ways in which studies of Gothic fiction and Gothic culture can help us understand what's going on in video games and help us kind of understand or discuss or describe the various processes. And it's really interesting that terms such as Gothic and the uncanny have already been in circulation today. And I think a lot of this talk will fits very well with a lot of the things that the previous talkers have spoken about. So that's in the Gothic. What do we understand by the Gothic? Can anyone give me an example of Gothic culture? Frankenstein, yes. So one of the first, the novel, but also the many films that have been produced. Anything else?
Picture of Dorian Gray.
Picture of Dorian Gray, yes. About the painting that has this kind of strange, we'd say, uncanny relationship with the protagonist. Yes.
Northanger Abbey.
Northanger Abbey, yes, which I think is one of the first Gothic pieces of work, but also as a kind of parody of the Gothic. So there's something really interesting about that. The Gothic as a literary mode. It wasn't long after the Gothic was sort of established that people started ripping the piss out of it, which I think is really interesting. And it's a mode which does have a kind of Gothic, it does have this kind of self-parody element to it. It's not supposed to be taken seriously, it's very over the top. I mean, something like Five Nights at Freddy's, which I mentioned, is Gothic. You're not supposed to take it seriously. The whole point of that game is to really scare you, but the whole situation that you're in is ridiculous. And it's not about authenticity or verisimilitude or kind of like drawing you into a world which you know is real. It's about, in some ways, there's something kind of ironic about the Gothic. So. As a quote from David Pundry, he says, in the last 20 years, the cultural meanings and implications of Gothic have grown even broader. In the 1980s, for example, it came to describe a kind of pop music, but also the whole swathe of fashion, dress, and indeed social behaviour and style associated with that music. There's a whole different, and some of the examples he gives, when I was writing, no one mentioned Tim Burton, because Tim Burton in some ways as a filmmaker exemplifies the Gothic in so many different ways. We've got kind of Gothic music. I think Punter talks about the Watchmen series as a kind of Gothic series. So you've got things like horror movies, particularly films which are using a kind of German expressionist aesthetic. We've got kind of Nosferatu and Dr. Caligari there, but also a more recent film, Dark City, in the top right-hand corner. We've got those kind of universal horror films like Frankenstein and Dracula and so on. Use of lots of shadows, lots of kind of like angular shots, and of course film noir, which is although it's, it doesn't have any kind of elements of supernatural or monsters in it, has a very kind of what we think of a kind of very Gothic aesthetic. One of the interesting things I think about a film noir, if those of you are familiar with it, is a film style which kind of emerged in the kind of post-war period. And quite a lot of film noir films were made by people who didn't have very much money, so they would use shadows and they'd use black sets and use lots of darkness to disguise the fact that they didn't actually have very kind of good sets, that the sets would look particularly realistic. There's a movie called Kiss Me Deadly, I don't know if anyone's heard of it, but it's got a fantastic scene where a detective goes to meet a woman, and he goes to her apartment, and her apartment is just a bed and an empty birdcage. And that is all that set is. It's just set in complete darkness. Now, obviously, that's a very, very cheap set, but the impact of it is really quite devastating because the woman in question is dying of leukemia, so it just has this really kind of dark, bleak aesthetic to it. And I think it's an interesting parallel there with a lot of the techniques that survival horror game makers use. So, for example, the use of mist, the use of darkness, a lot of that is kind of designed to kind of overcome the technical limitations of the game's console. So I think there's some really interesting parallels there where something which is economic then becomes a kind of aesthetic or a style in its own right. And then we've got kind of Gothic TV, things like Vampire Diaries and Buffy and True Blood. There's a very interesting writer who talks about the idea of the Gothic suburban, so things like the invasion of bodies such as Stepford Wives. Desperate Housewives is an interesting one. And one of the things I'm very interested in terms of the Gothic is we can think about the Gothic as a kind of set of aesthetics, so things can look very Gothic. But the Gothic is also a series of themes or narrative tropes. And we can think about things, there are some things, so for example, Ruby Gloom in the top left-hand corner is an animation show which looks very Gothic. It looks like it was designed by Tim Burton, but the actual stories are very sweet and very friendly and not dark in any way, although it's got a very Gothic aesthetic. Similarly, The Cure look really Gothic, but something like Love Cats, it's just it's quite a cheerful, upbeat pop song. In contrast, we've got something like Desperate Housewives, which doesn't look very Gothic, but by goodness, the stories in that show are absolutely from the kind of the page of Gothic fiction. Or someone like Joy Division, they don't look, they're quite gloomy, they're not kind of like goths as we would understand it, but their music does have that kind of Gothic feel to it. So there's some really interesting things about kind of Gothic in terms of aesthetics and themes. Here's some further quotes. This is Punter. He says that Gothic is characterised by an emphasis on portraying the terrifying, a common insistence on arcane settings, a prominent use of the supernatural, the presence of highly stereotyped characters, and the attempt to deploy a perfect technique of literary suspense. And then Savoy talks about the claustrophobic, gloomy settings imbued with a sense of forthcoming violence. And I think that chimes with many of the games which have been talked about today. Spaces such as haunted houses, tombs and prisons, the contaminating influence of family curses and revenge-driven ghosts. Further examples which I've picked out, Kafka, talking about Gothic film, talks about the blurring of subjective boundaries where we're not entirely sure whose story we should believe or who's actually being kind of represented. Spooner talks about the way in which in Gothic fiction sometimes it's difficult to tell where the narrator's internal world stops and the external world begins. So there's a very famous short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, which is about a woman basically going insane after her husband locks her up in her bedroom and starts seeing things in the wallpaper. You're never sure whether what she's seeing is actually real or not, or if she's going crazy. There's a lot of that going on, and again, like Silent Hill is full of this. You're not sure whether the characters are actually experiencing things really, or if what you're seeing on the screen is real or a projection of the character's insanity. Becker talks about the assault on bourgeois sensibilities and classical realism, and Sage and Lloyd talk about the Gothic is the perfect anonymous language of the peculiar unwillingness of the past to go away. And I've chosen that quote to kind of exemplify this talk because I think a lot of the games which which I'm going to be talking about, you are uncovering something that happened in the past. Video games have this kind of problem with narrative. The trouble with narrative is something that's supposed to be happening as it's being narrated, and the interactive element of video games kind of complicates that. So what you quite often have is video games which involve a narrative which you are uncovering. It's something that's already happened, so you can't change it, you can't impact upon it. What you can do is you can find the fragments of it that are littered around the space, the kind of little the memos that are scattered around the spaces in Resident Evil, or the audio cassettes, the audio clips that are scattered around Rapture. But also I think there's something interesting about the way in which what we're looking at here are kind of traditional tropes which can be traced back hundreds of years to traditional stories. We're seeing these same kinds of narratives, these same kind of themes emerging in contemporary horror video games. Botting, and this is one of the first writers who was actually talking about video games. All those other writers were either talking about film or literature. Botting talks about And he's describing the video game Doom here, saying that it's full of labyrinths, ghostly figures and monstrous mutants, violent shocks and graphic images, a repetitive structure which provides imaginative narrative involvement for more immediate sensational pleasure. And that sensational pleasure is, in some ways is a kind of a guilty pleasure, but that's what we're kind of seeing. Again, Five Nights at Freddy's. It's not a complicated story. It's not you've got no kind of like deep psychological characters. It doesn't help make you kind of reflect upon the meaning of life. It's designed to make you absolutely petrified as you're playing this really simple game. So there's ways in which you can think about video games in general in terms of the Gothic. So quite often the Gothic is thought of as a kind of degraded culture. It's violent, overstimulating, crude. There's all these kind of like parallels writers are drawn between what was said about early Gothic fiction and how it would kind of corrupt people if they read these novels, and the kind of things that's said about video games. I think that's a slightly problematic parallel, but it's one which is worth making. The emphasis on spectacle and excess, the spatial storytelling. A lot of Gothic fiction is about people investigating, exploring spaces. Think about The Shining. The hotel in The Shining is almost like a kind of character within the narrative. In the same way, video games. A lot of people, if anyone's read Henry Jenkins, he comes up with this idea of narrative, architectural storytelling. The idea that you tell the story through the space the player's investigating. Gothic fiction does similar kind of things. And you've got the emphasis on pastiche and surface, again, that kind of slightly ironic element. So, some examples which aren't necessarily, some of these are kind of Gothic in their aesthetics, but others not. Devil May Cry 3. Devil May Cry is a fantastic example of the Gothic. Not just because it looks really Gothic, but also you've got that kind of really cheesy rock music that plays whenever you get into a fight, and the way that the game shouts, yeah, cool, awesome, whenever you're doing all these things. It's not a game which is almost reveling in its lack of sophistication, because that's not what it's not about. Sophistication, it's about kind of the pleasure of being Dante and being really cool and killing these monsters while you're eating your pizza. Grand Theft Auto, again, I think the controversy surrounding Grand Theft Auto, the way in which Rockstar kind of caught that controversy, but also there's a theme in Gothic fiction of an interest in kind of the macabre or the criminal. Things like Dead Space has already been mentioned, and something like Portal. Again, it doesn't look very Gothic, but if you think the narrative is you're imprisoned in this maze, in this place, and then you've got this voice which is kind of persecuting you. If you replace the kind of Aperture research lab with a kind of big Gothic mansion and replace a GLaDOS with the voice of Vincent Price, you've got a kind of Gothic story. So I think there's something about the structure of that game which is very kind of Gothic. So I just spent a lot of time talking about survival horror and doing work on survival horror, and I think survival horror is an interesting genre because, and obviously there's horror, but there are examples there of horror games, but they're not survival horror. Survival horror is a very specific subgenre, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Then we've got some kind of examples, some academic definitions of survival horror, because it is a genre, I think maybe because it is specific to the video game medium, that has attracted quite a lot of critical attention. Right, one of the few books which is just about a particular genre is a book published edited by Bernard Perron, and that's all about horror video games. This is for Kelman, games in which the player usually takes the role of a normal human being in an environment overrun by demons, zombies, ghosts, etc. Or Perron says, in a third-person perspective, the gamer has to find clues, gather objects, and solve puzzles in order to survive with the weapons he has or will come across. The gamer has to face numerous impure, disgusting, creepy, and theft-tripping monsters, and so forth. Or you're trapped in a mansion, a small town, you're surrounded by horror, and you've got to survive. There's various kind of definitions. My favourite one is the last one, an action-adventure game employing a third-person perspective and drawing on horror film iconography, in which typically average character navigates a maze-like landscape, solving puzzles and fighting with monsters with limited ammunition, energy, speed, and replenishing it. I think I covered everything now. So there's various kind of discussions of the origins of survival horror. Some people say it's Alone in the Dark. Others say the origins is a game called Sweet Home. I say Hunt the Wampus. which is a game where you're typing. It's from 1972. It's a game where you're typing in. It's not even visual. You're just typing things into the screen. You're in a maze. There's a wampus there. You've got 5 arrows. You choose to move or shoot depending on. It's basically the entire. The mechanics of survival horror are there. Does anyone know where the term survival horror came from? Because there's this whole issue of where generic terms come from, which is really quite important to genre scholars. So the term film noir is an interesting one because it emerged in the 60s. It was not used by filmmakers, but was used by French film critics. If this works, whenever this does work, it's always really impressive. We can date the emergence of the term survival horror to Resident Evil, the first Resident Evil game, which opened like this. So that's where the term is coined, right at the beginning of Resident Evil. Now what's interesting is some writers said, well, actually Resident Evil isn't a very good example of survival horror because you're a military person, because you've got, you're not that kind of helpless, weaponless individual that you are in subsequent games. But I think survival horror, we can think about this game in terms of breaking it down to sort of its narrative, in terms of its iconography and its gameplay, and think about these in terms of the Gothic. So firstly, you've got the narrative. I'm going to just skip that one. So you've got the Gothic narrative. We quite often have a detailed backstory, quite a lot of frequent use of cutscenes. So there is a kind of quite narrative-heavy element in quite a lot of certainly the kind of the sort of classic PlayStation 2 era survival horror games. Usually you have an ordinary lone protagonist trapped in an isolated location. I mean, some of my favourite examples, Haunting Ground is a perfect example of a survival horror game. Or what's it called, Eternal Darkness, Santa's Requiem, which is also kind of like where just the dynamics of the game and the aesthetics of the game just work so well together. Or Silent Hill 3, I think, is probably my favourite, best example of the survival horror genre. Quite often involves an investigation of past events, often involving the protagonist's own history. So this is, again, this kind of uncovering of some family secrets, which is very Gothic. And also the kind of monstrous elements, possession, religious cult, zombification, experiments gone wrong, and ancient evil. Think about iconography, what the games actually look like. They'll employ these kind of like grotesque images, giant spiders, two-headed babies and so forth, and zombies and etc. Not very many vampires. I think it's interesting, not many vampires in video games. There's also zombies though. So we have this iconography of haunted houses, ghosts, zombies, monsters, blood and gore. There's flashlight, then the shotgun, which are almost like the two kind of iconic elements of the survival horror game. I really love the moment in Halo, the first Halo game, when you find the shotgun and suddenly it goes all survival horror. It's great, and it's like, here's the weapon that you need in order to deal with this sudden change of the genre that the game you're playing. And also this use of darkness. Again, we talked about this earlier. The trope of the protagonist, which is you can only see what's in front of you, and obviously it's a technical limitation which is being managed there, but also produces this really kind of fantastic aesthetic and really terrifying experience. We've got gameplay, the third-person perspective, which I think is really in a lot of the survival horror games that I've written about. It seems to be really important because you're kind of like you're watching this person getting hurt. Quite a lot of the early survival horror games, you're actually limping as you're walking along. I think there's something lost in the third-person horror video game as a consequence. You've got actions, a combination of puzzle and action. It's not just about blowing things up because you don't have enough resources to do that. You have to kind of like solve a puzzle. You have to spend a lot of time hiding. I don't know if anyone's played Forbidden Siren. It's a really great horror game where basically you creep around this environment. There are all these zombies, and the way you find out where the zombies are, you can tap into their brains and you can see things through their eyes, and then you have to basically work out where they are, work out their movement patterns, and can run around. And one of the worst moments in that game is when you're seeing things through the eyes of the zombie, and the zombie sees you sat there crouched down, completely immobile, in plain view. It's a game which plays with with the power of seeing and the power of hiding and the importance of not being seen and the importance of vision, which is a traditional theme within horror. We've got kind of claustrophobic architecture. The cinematic camera angles, again, like there's something about the the way that the camera cuts in a lot of those kind of like early Silent Hill games, I think is really kind of Gothic. It's linear structure that quite often you're following a single path and it's inescapable. You can't go off and kind of steal a car and drive around. You are stuck following the path that the designers have set for you. I spent a lot of time talking about Silent Hill, series which has been going on for a long time. And although I think these games, there's interesting things about all of them. I didn't really get on with Downfall, but almost all these games have something really interesting about them. If anyone could summarise the story of Silent Hill for me, I'd be very, very grateful, because it's one which I can only really think I've gathered through reading things online. The narrative of Silent Hill is there's this woman who ends up in a hospital, locked in the basement, and they adopt this child, but then ends up going back to Silent Hill in order to kind of somehow combine with the woman in the basement. And this is all that happens before the first game actually starts. You start with a rival. So as a story, there's Silent Hill 2, which has nothing to do with this at all. There's Silent Hill Origins, which goes back to you play as the truck driver who tried to rescue the girl from the burning house. And interrupted the sacred ceremony which would have given birth to the monstrous god. So it's a really complicated narrative. It's full of secret religious organisations, occult happenings, monstrous families, hidden secrets, child abuse, terrifying spaces, psychological disturbances, all the things which make up Gothic fiction. It's a really kind of Gothic narrative. Also, I think the fact that it's fragmented, the fact that it kind of goes across all these different stories, they all add different things to it. Some of those things contradict other things. As exactly what the canon of this game is really unclear. Shattered Memories is quite fascinating, because in that game you're actually playing someone narrating the story of Silent Hill 1 to a psychiatrist. And in that office you are answering questions, and then the game that you play, that you then kind of go to the flashback of what happened, the story you're telling the psychiatrist, that changes every time you play the game based upon how you answer the questions. So it's set in this kind of completely kind of unreal sort of dream space, which isn't, basically the events you're playing as a gamer aren't the things that really happened. You're playing a kind of imaginative version of the protagonist's memories. It's really fascinating, but again, very kind of Gothic in its lack of, where you're not really clear what's going on, you're not clear kind of whether what you're playing is real or not. There's also this issue of split subjectivities, the figure of a lesser, who is both that child that burned in the house, is the grown-up woman in the basement, I think she becomes two other characters as well. She's Cheryl, and also she's the protagonist of Silent Hill 3, something you only can realise halfway through the game. It does exist in all these kind of multiple ways. So that idea of the self being fragmented, that's a very kind of Gothic thing. And there's also the issue of the uncanny. I think there's something really fascinating about the uncanny in relation to video games in as a whole. I mean, because basically when you're playing a video game, you are, if one of the things that the uncanny is about, it is about that lack of certainty as to whether something is alive or not. The blurring of the boundary between the animate and the inanimate. And video game, when you're playing a video game, you're moving a character around on the screen. It looks like it's alive, but it isn't. If you've ever played World of Warcraft and you see all these people running around, acting like they are alive, and they are, there are people kind of controlling them, but they're not. You're just seeing pixels on the screen. And a lot of horror games need to sort of play with this. So that's why I think there's so many zombies in video games, because the zombie is something, the horror of the zombie is about, is it alive or not? And of course, nothing you're seeing on the game screen is alive, but the horror game kind of plays with this uncertainty. So you have that experience of, you're playing a horror game, you walk into a room, and there are loads of dead bodies lying around on the floor. And you're like, okay, well, I'm just going to walk through that room. I'm sure, what's the worst thing that could happen? And you just think, yeah, any moment those bodies are going to come to life. Or it could be like pictures on the wall. Or it could be stone statues. Haunting Ground is a really good example of a game which is all about puppets and mannequins and dolls and their propensity to suddenly come alive. So I think there's something uncanny about video games in general. I actually did a whole paper on video game creepypasta, which I think is a really interesting subject. And I mean, anyone play the game and it starts to glitch, that's a really uncanny experience, because it suddenly starts going wrong. And there's a really good example of this in Red Dead Redemption. There was a glitch which meant that the animals and the humans got kind of muddled up, and you'd see these kind of people walking around with horse faces, or there would be kind of animals that were half human, half animal that you could ride around on. And I use this as an example in a paper once all about kind of the uncertainty of the Gothic, and someone came up to me and said, that story's not true. That was something Rockstar put out there deliberately to try and get attention for the game. So I think it's something really interesting again about that kind of like blurring of, you're seeing something on YouTube. Is it real? Is it something that is really happening in the game, or is it something which the games industry is putting out as part of its promotional process? Now, Freud talks that if you want a really interesting read, and it is it might sound a bit off-putting, but Freud's piece of work on the uncanny is a really fascinating read. It's not really a psychoanalytic piece. It's more about literature. It's a kind of analysis of a Hoffman story, the Sandman. So it's a really, and he's all the way through this piece. He's trying to pinpoint what is the uncanny, what is it, and he's always saying, well, it's a bit of this, but then it's also not. It's a bit of this, and it's sort of like when you have this kind of strange experience of deja vu, or you're wandering around somewhere and you're a bit lost, or where you kind of like drink a cup of tea thinking that it's coffee. It's sort of like, it's all this kind of strange thing. It never really kind of pinpoints exactly what it is that the uncanny is. But there's other various themes of the uncanny which we can identify, things like dreamlike states, doubles, other worlds, the querying of kind of something being animate or inanimate. The compulsion to repeat is a really interesting one, given that video games involve a lot of repetition. And also he talks about, there's all this thing about the home, the family home, which is analogous to the maternal womb. And we've got this going on in space in Silent Hill. In Silent Hill 2, there's the kind of Mary Maria character, this kind of double of the dead character's protagonist's wife. Heather in Silent Hill 3 encounters Alessa, who's this kind of double of her. There's this whole theme of kind of like something unnatural breaking forth into the real world, and in Silent Hill, one of the mechanics is you're walking around this ordinary town, and then suddenly it all goes horribly wrong, and everything's covered in blood and shit, and it's, it becomes this kind of really nasty space. So there's this kind of idea of, one of the themes of the Gothic as being, and one of the themes of the uncanny being this kind of two existing worlds kind of colliding together, the real world and the supernatural world. The whole theme of home, I think it's this when I gave this talk way back in 2009, this worked really well because Silent Hill Homecoming had just come out. I say, the first survival horror game being Sweet Home in 1989, and then 20 years later we have Silent Hill Homecoming, the theme of the home being quite prominent in them. And I think this was a conference on the Gothic, and I was playing Homecoming at the time. And Homecoming is a really creepy game for lots of different reasons. Maybe not the most successful one, but it's about someone coming home, and they come home and the home is strangely changed, and there's none of their childhood friends are around, everything's surrounded in mist. And you're walking through the house, and all the pictures of you as a child have been taken down from the walls. When I was playing this game, I was thinking, oh please, I just want the other world to seep in. That would be so fantastic. That would be a really good example for me to quote in my paper. And thankfully, about 2/3 of the way through the game, you're in the family home, and suddenly it changes, and suddenly you're in this kind of gross, kind of bloody, messy, kind of rusty other world. So we've got the kind of, also we've got the theme of the maternal womb, which is part of the kind of uncanny, as Freud said, the maternal womb is this place that we can all kind of remember, but not really. And it's kind of, it's familiar, but it's also distant from ourselves. So, and in a lot of the Silent Hill games, certainly the early ones, this kind of theme of the maternal womb is there. In Silent Hill 3, your Heather, in order to discover her mother, in order to discover her origins, goes through this hospital which is full of blood, and she's climbing up this kind of umbilical ladder. In Silent Hill 4, there's this kind of like womb-like space that you can like travel through, this kind of fallopian tube that you can come out at the end. There's one of the first writers I found on video games, Gillian Skirrow, talks about the maternal cave of the video game as a space. Okay, I'm just going to close on that particular image to delight and entertain you. Thank you very much. Are there any questions?
Gothic is pretty slippery. Do you think you can go through Gothic and out the other side and it's not Gothic anymore? Like, is Bayonetta too cartoonish or not? Is it no longer Gothic?
I think that's a really interesting question, because I mean, one of the things about the Gothic is this question: is it a genre? Is it a disposition? Are there elements of the Gothic in everything? I think it's a really interesting way into thinking about certain kinds of horror games. I think there is something of the Gothic in certain aspects of video games, particularly the sort of spectacular violence that you have in the game. That in many games, the kind of excess of kind of blood and excessive kind of explosions. I mean, one way of thinking about that is through the kind of the pleasure of the Gothic, of the sensational. But yeah, that kind of cartoon, that when things become too self-aware, it's a bit of a problem. I mean, my sense is that certainly there are points when I've been playing Silent Hill, various games, and I've just thought, they've clearly read Freud. There's clearly this is not unintentional. There must be, particularly in Silent Hill 4, when the final weapon is an umbilical cord. That you're actually, from the serial killer that it's been haunting you, you kind of go into his mother's bedroom and find the umbilical cord in the cardboard box. It's almost kind of like got its Freudian credentials on its sleeve. But that's also an aspect of the Gothic, is this kind of self-reflexivity. There's a really interesting paper I read quite recently saying that horror comedies can be thought of as particularly Gothic, particularly when they kind of contain elements of Gothic criticism within them. So you've got something like Young Frankenstein, which is full of these kind of jokes about kind of Freudian interpretations of the Gothic within its own kind of Gothic narrative. I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it was entertaining. Yes?
Have you played Alan Wake? And if so, do you reckon that's a Gothic video game?
Alan Wake? No, I haven't, because I don't have an Xbox.
It's on PC now.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah. It's about, do you know what it's about?
Yeah, I've read about it. It does sound like a very kind of a good illustration of lots of the things I've been talking about. You play as a horror writer, don't you?
Yeah, and one of my friends thinks the whole thing is like a metaphor for depression.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, you're sort of being stalked by these things, and there's just dark shadows following you around the whole time, and the town subtly changes every so often.
Uh-huh.
I was hoping you could shed some light on it.
No, that sounds like a really, really good example. I'm certainly a lot of the Gothic is about nervous breakdowns, and the uncertain. I mean, I've actually read this in official strategy guides that talk about the monsters in Silent Hill as reflections of things that happened to the characters in their childhood. So yeah, there's in Silent Hill 2, there's this kind of big walking table thing that represents a kind of rapist father that gets killed by someone. This woman drops a television on his head. Monstrous furniture. It's it's quite kind of grotesque. Yes.
I was just going to follow up on Rob's point. I think camp is part of the Gothic, wouldn't you say? Because I mean, something like Rocky Horror Picture Show. You mentioned Young Frankenstein. Norfolk Abbey even is quite, in some ways, big part of the Gothic is being able to, as you say, to reflect on the Gothic and to make fun of the Gothic as well.
Yeah. I mean, Five Nights at Freddy's is a good example because it's supposed to be funny. When you first get to your first day of the job, and the guy who's left has left you a message saying, watch out because if one of them finds you, they're going to try and stuff you into a costume because they'll think that you're a kind of walking animatronics that's sort of lost its skin. It's supposed to be funny. That doesn't stop it from being. And what I think is really interesting is that the comedy or the self-reflexivity doesn't stop it from being impactful. It still makes it creepy.
I think that's fair. I mean, modern goths sort of celebrate Halloween, which is simultaneously, an older idea about monstrous spirits and all that kind of stuff, but is now this modern campy kitschy thing where people just wear costumes and children get candy and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and you go to the co-op down there and they've got kind of
right.
ghosts on the walls and it's kind of
That's
yeah, this
really
isn't scary at all.
I have to be the worst person ever. So I gotta come in so Seb can talk.
I haven't tried the new Silent Hill demo, like PT, the new Silent Hill.
Sorry?
The new Silent Hill on PlayStation 4. No?
No, not yet, no.
Have you seen the video? Like, no?
Is it good?
It's a demo, like, yeah, it's pretty scary.
Yeah. No, I've lost touch with the Silent Hill series. I've got the one on the Vita, Silent Hill Book of Memories. It's kind of put me up a bit because it's not really a horror game. I'll check that out.
Yeah. Cool, so everyone should get out this way.
So he is the smartest man in the room by a long way, right?